But I'll never forget the first day. He goes, "Hey, we got a day off. Should we go fishing, Dec?" What? You would actually fish with me? And we went out, and that guy, he fished that dry fly all day long. And he caught 6 fish that day on the dry line, on a floating fly. Half of them were dead drifted. So that everything that I was intrigued about him all came to fruition, and by gosh, it was true. So.
Welcome to In the Bucket, the podcast that explores the culture of spey fishing in the Pacific Northwest, a spectacular land of mountains and wild rivers where every cast has a story to tell. I'm your host, Brian Niska. In today's show, we're going to talk to some true legends in the Northwest spey fishing community. We've got George Cook back for another episode, joined by Dec Hogan, Scott O'Donnell, and Joseph Rossano. I truly cannot overstate the tremendous contribution this group has made to steelhead spey fishing arts and culture, spey casting instruction, fly design, and many of the tackle innovations we enjoy today. This bunch has a long history of fishing together, so I'm excited to hear their stories. Let's get into it. Right on, folks. I am stoked for today's show. We are blessed today to have George Cook, Scott O'Donnell, and Dec Hogan on In the Bucket. George, why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, good morning, gents. I'm George Cook. I live in Washington State, and I have been with Sage Fly Rod since 1987 and a rep since 1990 in Oregon, Washington, Alaska. And I've known these two characters that are with us today since about 1988, and sometime today I will tell some colorful history of these.
I'm Scott O'Donnell here in Oregon, Troy, Oregon, on the Grand Ronde River. I've got a fishing lodge, Speywater Lodge, still guiding, Oregon coast in the spring, and been a Sage ambassador and Rio ambassador for quite a while now. Don't even know how long. And yeah, I've known these guys a long time, and you too, Brian.
Yeah, I remember running into you on the Thompson. Basically, God bless the Thompson. I wish we were still able to fish there.
Yeah, me too.
Me too. Cool. Hey, guys, I'm Dec Hogan. Started back with these guys way back when and guided on the Skagit, cut my teeth there, and Skagit, Skycoma, still Squamish. I don't know, from 89 to 2003-ish, and then had a big life change. And in that time, I moved to Utah. And if you ask me where I fish for steelhead in Utah, I always say Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and British Columbia. And through all that, I wrote a book called The Passion for Steelhead, which proud to say that it's pretty well received. And it's 20 years now, and we're at that Spey Clave last week, and I signed probably 24 of them. So I love this stuff, still just as passionate today as I was the day I met George Cook in 1988. So, and Scott O'Donnell in 1987.
Yeah, I got to say, this is probably the most firepower we've had on this show. George, this is the second time we've had you on here. The last time we saw you, we were all excited to talk about the upcoming Sandy River Spey Clave. So let me ask you, was the event as big of a success as we thought it was going to be?
Yeah, I think I'm going to tell you there was about 300-400 people there in 2 days. There was a great percentage of new people that had never been to it, even though it had basically there were a lot of new faces. And these two boys, along with myself, we all got to speak on the various days. And I think it was a great success. And me and Marty, passes all the acclaim on to Mia, but between the two of them, led by Mia, they did a great job, a fantastic job.
They did. Yeah, they really did. They were 150% dedicated to that too, just nonstop all day and proceeding, and I'm sure, and even afterwards with their follow-up. Pretty cool.
Mia did most of the work, though.
Yeah, of course.
In that episode, George, we talked a little bit about the history of the Clave, and the one thing with this community that never ceases to amaze me is the willingness of the OG members to share with the beginners, right? I think that's pretty unique. And, you three guys, a little bit older than me, and I think that we're really neatly positioned because you guys were there at the beginning And if there was anyone doing it before you, you knew who they were, and you're still doing it. So you're not in that camp of, oh, everything sucks now and everything used to be good and you guys don't know what you've lost. You're still out there doing it. But I think there is a real shifting baselines thing when it comes to understanding, what used to be there. And certainly we've lost a lot of stuff along the way. I want to open this with this question that's been bugging me a lot. And it's, do closures actually do anything? Is there an example you guys can think of where we've seen a river get closed and then the population of fish comes back to a sustainable, fishable number?
I personally haven't seen that. Defer to Scott or George, but I personally have not seen that.
I think the Green River, but that's an unusual, that's a different situation, I think, than what you're talking about. That after Mount St. Helens blew and they closed that river system up there. And, they thought, that all those salmon and steelhead were just going to get wiped out. And then what was it? Not 5-6 years later, just huge returns started coming back in there after it had been closed for a while. But I think that's a little different than what you're talking.
Yeah. Even then fish start returning to the Toutle River too. But that is a different situation. Yeah, but for the Skagit, for instance, yeah, and the Skykomish, they close those rivers and they remain closed. And then they'll open them occasionally and numbers haven't improved. They opened the Skagit this year thinking they had a bunch of new fish and they wound up emergency closing it during the mid-season, the special season. I'm not a doom and gloom guy. Like you said, we're all still here doing this and we're still passionate, but it's things, some things aren't the same. Some things might be as good or better. I don't know. Well, tell me where they are.
Well, we've seen, over the years, all of us, all four of us, most certainly including Brian in British Columbia, but, I never thought we'd ever fish the Wenatchee again, right? But it's been open a time or two, the Met Howe a time or two. I hunt early archery up on the Okanagan every year up in that twist country, and I drive along the Okanagan, and there's plenty of fish that have been in that the last couple of years, but, the back and forth with the tribe has never quite allowed it to, be open. And there's a lot of yummy water even on that ditch. But you watch these closures, we see them a lot in Alaska, right, with, Chinook this, Chinook that. And I guess my viewpoint is, Brian, is by the time, let's take Alaska for an example. They'll close something, maybe, it might be open 5 days and then suddenly it's closed. There's Joe. And by the time they close it, the damage that led to it being closed, well, that damage already occurred. And in the case of the Chinook, most of that damage is out in the big blue. So, I think it's reactionary. And like Dec says, once they're closed, boy, it's a far cry to see them reopened. No question.
Right on. I want to keep going on this topic for a little bit, but we got to introduce our fourth guest. We've got Joseph Rossano joining us here, fighting against the tech and prevailing. Nice work, Joe.
It was the other link that you sent that worked. Nice to see everybody.
Joseph, so the other gentlemen already introduced themselves to our listeners. Why don't we just take a minute and why don't you tell everybody listening who you are and a little bit about yourself, please?
In less than 20 words.
In less than 20 words. My name's Joe Rossano, and I'm an artist, and I live in the valley of the Stillaguamish. I guess I've been here for 37 years or something like that, and I've had the benefit of bumping into each one of these individuals at least a couple of times, and we shared a unique period in time together, and I'm grateful to actually be on this call with them, and you, Brian.
Wonderful. So once again, discussing this idea of closures and recognizing that fisheries managers have a tough task in front of them, but they really have this one lever that they like to pull, and that's taking away the anglers. And I just don't believe it does anything. I think our impacts are so low, and I think in a lot of ways we we sort of self-police ourselves in the sense that if fishing's slow, there's not that many fish being caught. There's not that many anglers participating. And there's I think a real legitimate upside to keeping people on the water, which is, dissuading poachers. And
Absolutely.
And Scott, you and I were talking before the show started about these test fisheries that we use in BC, these gill nets that we kill fish to find out how many of them are there. And you said, man, I could do a better job doing it with my rod and reel. And I think I truly believe that. So, down the road, maybe there's a way we can move away from these silly gill net test fisheries. But Joe, what's your thoughts on closures? Do you think that there's any examples of a river that's been closed and then saw some form of recovery when it comes to steelhead?
This is a giant can of worms. Being introspective, I feel like I have to understand both sides of the argument. And I agree with, the whole concept that if you close the river down and you forget about it in your heart and your mind and in your annual activities as an angler, it's hard to get that back. I mean, we've seen that play out multiple times. At the same time, I do think that we have a responsibility to bring people together. We see things in a different way than a different type of fisherman might see it. And with the way steelhead fly fishing and steelhead fishing in general has become popularized, certainly, my home on the Skagit, I'm seeing many more non-fly fishermen fishing in catch-release fishery, and they are much more successful than us. And I just, I know that what they calculate that there's a 10% mortality. And if we're not encountering a lot of fish and there's a 10% mortality, does that equate to something grand in the larger scheme? I don't have an answer to that, but I'm not going to say that it doesn't, because I think that's hubris and that we have to sort of be aware that we have all had an impact regardless of our background or demographics, etc. We have to be responsible. Then they'll maybe open it for us because we show that we care. At least that's my perspective. I could be naive. I am an idealist, but that's my opinion.
10% sounds really high to me for a mortality rate on catch and release. That sounds absurd to me. I have a hard time believing that I kill 1 out of 10 fish that I release.
Well, one thing, Brian, that I've kind of talked about around campfires and in stores with retailers is the idea that rather than close these rivers, put them on a permit draw. Put them into a situation much like big game where, say, the Skagit or the Ho or the Wenatchee or, pick your ditch, right? You put them on a draw and say there's a 6-week season on the Skagit, on the Skykomish, on the Ho. And you're only going to draw a certain number of bodies. Doesn't matter if they're fly or they're gear. We kick the bait game out of the way, of course. And can you imagine a guy that waltzes into the local fly shop and says, hey, man, I drew the Skykomish first week of April. I got to get ready. I mean, can you imagine? It'd be like a guy drawing a moose permit in Northeast Washington or a sheep permit anywhere in the country. It would just be this. And then you've got these people that are absolutely the guardians of the galaxy being that Steelhead River that they've drawn a tag on. Not to mention the revenue basis that could derive for this. I mean, Fish and Game could put whatever price they want on that permit, and not dissimilar to what some of the big game tags are. They'd have a hell of a revenue source, and at that point, the enforcement question ought to go away about not being able to afford enforcement. It would solve a lot of things, in my opinion, but that'll be my rant for today.
Cool. Sign me up.
Brian, on your test fishery situation, something similar to that would be beautiful. Say put 100 people, 100 anglers on the river for one day or maybe 2 days, and put a draw permit on it and charge a premium for it, and they'd make some money on it.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And we'd release them. And I got to say, Scott, I really agree with you. I think 10% sounds really high. I recognize that there's science out there to support it. But when you actually look into a lot of the catch and release studies that have been done, they're not handling fish the way that we do. And I think in you guys' tenure, I believe, Dec, you started guiding in the late 80s. We've seen fish handling practices, I think, generally improve. We've done a few things, and I think anglers have driven these changes. Up here, we've got single barbless hooks. George talked about removing the bait. I think, generally speaking, we've done everything that we can to improve the survivability of an encounter with these magnificent creatures. What do you guys think? Is there more that we can do? Keeping fish wet, etc. What else can we do to lower catch and release mortality?
We need to educate, but we need to educate the other user groups as well. Because as fly fishers, we tend to be better at handling the fish. And I know there's guys that hold them out for 27 pictures for their Instagram post, but in general, it's some of the other user groups would be nice if they got on board. And I know a lot of them are good at it. Barbless, this is kind of tongue in cheek, but a few years ago when they were closing the Deschutes, when the Deschutes River is getting closed, things are rugged, things are bad. And I'm still guiding over on the Grand Ronde. And we had some guys drop out very close to the trip because they didn't want to be responsible for killing the last wild steelhead. And my reply to one of these gentlemen, who was a regular client of ours, I said, so when it was really good 3 years ago, arbitrarily, how many did you catch? He goes, well, they got blanked that week with you guys. Okay. Why don't you come on out?
Yeah.
So anyway, but yeah, that's how I feel.
On catch and release mortality, I mean, what's the cause of death, right? I think probably what has to be the most significant cause of death on catch and release fish has got to be, getting that hook just in the perfect spot in a gill raker or the back of the tongue where they bleed out. And oftentimes they're dead when you land them, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And so I don't believe that barbless hooks are the thing. I don't think a barbed hook or a barbless hook is a big deal nowadays. With modern hooks, the barbs are tiny, and it's very easy to remove those fish without doing a bunch of damage. But I think if you put a barbless hook, or I know for a fact, you put a barbless hook in the gill raker, right in the middle of that gill raker, it's going to bleed out just as much as if it's a barbed hook. I don't think that.
Or in the back of the tongue, like you said. Yeah.
Maybe the size of the hook is going to make a big difference. I think if the hooks are too large, they tend to grab them deeper. Certainly, if it's a double hook or a triple, a treble hook, they don't slide out to the mouth like a single hook does. I don't know whether offset or non-offset hooks make a difference as far as, hooking them deeper. I think probably offset hooks tend to hook them a little deeper, and we want the hook to slide. Once they engulf the hook, we want it to slide out to the lip and get them in the corner or on the lip somewhere. And so you have to have hooks that will do that. But I don't think barbed or barbless makes a big difference.
I fish barbless for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say, guys, just based on Chinook, in that idea, Scott, that it's that deep hook, it's that gill raker. And you're right. You land them, they suddenly have that olive color. And when they've got that olive color, that critter's as dead as the last deer I shot. And I would tell you guys, it's probably, if somebody said, well, what do you think you guys are killing? 8 days of Chinook fishing between three of you. I think we're killing one fish out of every 70 that we know that, oh yeah, this guy, we're going to feed him to the eagles, right? Or if Brown Boo is downstream, he might get this one. But yeah, I mean, I think 10% is probably just a number, and it's probably a number of convenience for somebody somewhere, because it's just rare that you get one that does that. And I would tell you guys, on Chinook, it's more often a jack that does that, the big swallow, than it is a mature fish that's, say north of 15 pounds.
Personally, if it would truly was 10% and you could prove that to me, I don't know if I would fish anymore.
Right, yeah.
Now, I can't be responsible for that. I mean, like a lot of days, my years guiding on the Deschutes, we'd have been killing a fish a day.
I think the ratio that George just, put out there is about what my experience has been with steelhead in terms of, them not reviving. And, I found that the longer the hook, the greater the incidence of that happening. So back in the days when we used to use those long carry Stevens before we started using tubes as much, that was more common. And yeah, so I think the number is more about having a built-in error that is in favor of the fish if we're going to have a catch and release fishery, not that it's a real number. Does that make sense? So it's probably 3% in reality, but they're going to say they're going to in their model use. We need to talk to a biologist and a statistician because that's not me.
When it comes to high-quality flies that truly elevate your fly fishing game, Drifthook.com is the trusted source you need. I've been using Drifthook's expertly selected flies for a while now, and they never disappoint. Plus, they stand behind their products with a money-back guarantee. Are you ready to upgrade your fly box? Head over to Drifthook.com today and use the code SWING at checkout to get 15% off your first order. That's Drifthook, Drifthook.com. Don't miss out. This year, I ventured into the heart of eastern Idaho's Yellowstone Teton territory where the fish were larger than life and the waters held the secrets of the best fly fishing out west. With crystal clear rivers like the Henry's Fork and the South Fork of the Snake and enough lakes to keep you going all year long, make your way to Yellowstone Teton territory and embark on a journey to one of North America's finest fly fishing destinations. It's time to experience eastern Idaho for yourself and support this podcast at the same time.
Well, I did pose the same question to John McMillan, and I got a fairly similar answer to the number you guys are using. Maybe slightly higher, but in the same ballpark. And essentially the point that John made was that, like everybody on this call, his game is pretty tight. He knows how to treat fish. And when we're looking at these numbers from a management standpoint, we need to take into account Joe Bag of Donuts, who, doesn't treat fish the way Scott O'Donnell does. And once again, that comes back to education. And I look south of the border, and I've never fished down there, but I know you guys have an interesting regulation where you're not allowed to take a wild steelhead out of the water. And we've talked about that up here. And for whatever reason, that was never, a discussion to turn into a regulation here, but becomes more of an educational thing. And I think, in my view, education goes a lot further than regulation. Kind of goes like catch and release limits is a good example. How do you kill less fish? We'll catch less of them. Should we make it a law that you can only catch a couple, or should we just, hopefully over time people figure out that, when you've had your fill, just to hang out and do something else for a little bit.
Yeah. And then at the same time, I kind of question how, like Joe's saying, opening a can of worms. I mean, how much effect do we really have on the big picture? Some guys with, out fly fishing, who most of us suck anyway. And you just get a lucky fish now and then because steelhead are aggressive. But I don't think we're the problem. We have to make our contributions, obviously. Anytime we're connected to one of those fish, we have a responsibility. But I think that the much, much, much bigger than a few fly fishermen on the river.
I think there'd be a big difference in technique, too. I mean, we're swinging, right? And so I don't think they tend to get the flies as deep as somebody fishing a bobber and a bead that's dead drifting. Those go immediately to the back of the mouth. And so they probably hook, those fish deeper a little bit more. I can't speak for it from experience, but, trout fishing in Alaska, we're catching 30 to, and these are, they're as big of fish as I'm catching here on the Grand Ronde, right? And we're catching 30 to 80 of these fish a day, and we're not killing a fish every day. We might kill one or two a week, but that doesn't equate to 10%. Now, I watch other guides, and I think they're killing more fish. I see them, using nets, and they got to get that fish. They're chasing them around out in the middle of the river with a net, and then they get them in the net, and then they, because they think they're treating the fish better by netting them, and then they, carry the, they net the fish. They're, 80 feet away from the angler. And then they carry the thing out of the water all the way back to the angler and set it down on the bank, to get pictures. And then after about 4 or 5 minutes, they're going to hear me screaming from way downriver, hey, put that fish back, So there's definitely a higher mortality rate with some people, but
would you call him Joe or Brian Joe Bag of Donuts? I like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
This kind of speaks to George's point, though, about limited entry and managing fish the way that they manage wildlife, because we're way behind how they manage big game wildlife. And I'm just not convinced that, our Canadian fish managers, at least, can make the distinction and fully understand the difference between how we fish and maybe how another user group that dresses similarly and looks kind of like us, and the associated impacts that can be assigned to technique. Once again, this educational thing, right? And to what role do the angling public help shape the way we're managed? And the thing that I sort of see now is when you have these closures, you get this waterbed effect, right? They close one river, boom, puts the pressure on another fishery. It's a poor strategy.
There is a strategy employed in Atlantic Canada where there are zones of environmental conservation on each river. And there is public water on each of these rivers, and you can go in the day before or the day that you're going to fish, and you go into the office, and they allow a certain number of rods on a given section. And there's some unlimited water where they don't limit it. And then you pay your $10 or $15 or $400 if it's really exclusive water, and you get to fish. And, I've spoken to our brethren here about, would we do with something like that work? And there are a lot of people whose immediate response is, well, I pay my state taxes, I pay my federal taxes. I don't want to have to pay to fish every day. And I don't know that I completely disagree with them. We might want to have a different approach here. But George's approach is something I'd never thought about, like you pull a tag to fish the Skagit, this week. I do think people would be excited. I, on the other hand, would be disappointed because I wouldn't be able to fish every day. Hence, it would be great if we had sections of open water. But yes, some combination of that could work. And then there's also, this concept that we live in a technologically advanced world. My actions today do not prove that, right? But if we had an application that when you signed up or paid for your permit, you had to agree to participate in, and a non-interaction means you have nothing to report, and you had to report so that we actually became directly involved in the management or the monitoring in a meaningful way. There's another way that we could then become real stewards of the river. Some combination of those three things.
One thing that strikes me right away, just looking at this crew, is I think, man, between the group of us, we've put a lot of new anglers on the water over the years, and now these folks need to find some water of their own to fish. And when we see this loss of opportunity, this loss of access, not everybody can afford to fly around the world and fish somewhere remote. You need to have your local fishery. And it's a tricky thing, right? Because I'm sure all of us at one point or another have caught a little bit of flack for creating these new anglers and, maybe contributing to a river being a little busier than certain people like the way it was. So it's a tricky one. And I, as I get into my 50s here and I have these kids and I start to think, are they going to be able to have a similar experience to what we all got to do? And, I think you guys in particular had a really neat go of it because you saw the first Spey rods on the water. You tied new flies that no one else had seen before. You got other people excited. People looked at you probably at one point and said, what the heck are you doing? I'll never fish a two-hander. And then they're coming to you for lessons. So no one will have that experience again, right? Spey fishing's just too widespread. But let's get out of the politics for a minute and let's go back to the beginning. Dec, I know you started guiding in the late 80s. I'd asked George at our last show, who put a Spey rod in his hand the first time, and my memory's not too bad. I remember it was the Hardy rep at Kaufman Streamboard on a visit. But who put a Spey rod in your hands the first time, Dec?
So first of all, the first guiding I did was in 1989, and then it was limited, and then I really started up in the 90s. The very first two-handed rod I touched is the same one I believe Scott O'Donnell did, and that was our buddy Ed Ward, the three amigos. We were hanging out together back then, and Ed got one. It was an Orvis unfinished. I think it was a 9-weight, 13.5 foot, something like that. But either way, that was the first one that I touched. And then after that, if we want to go that far, was that first 9140-4 that Sage did. And George actually handed me one, and that was in 1990. While I've got the floor, I can tell you that when I grabbed that rod for the first time, even with Ed, it wasn't about the cast. The thing that struck me most was now my rod tip is that much closer to my fly, so it's swimming slower. And we talk about that mixer run on the Skagit, big broad run, and fish can be way out there. So we would cast our single-handed rods as far as we could. We'd wade out pretty far and cast as far as we could and hold it out there to slow the fly out there. So when I grabbed that rod for the first time and put it out there, I'm like, oh my gosh, the clouds parted and the angels sang, man, my fly was swimming slow way out there. That's what hooked me, because none of us knew how to cast. We just overhead the dang thing for quite a while. Till George came along. He didn't know how to cast either, but he was putting on a good show.
Dec, the mixer, there's that, I'll call it a famous photo. It's one that sticks in my memory of you casting on the Skagit. I think maybe it could have been an Airflow ad. Yeah. I hope I didn't get that wrong. Was that the mixer?
And no, that's a run up above the mixer called Sutter Creek or Swift Creek. Same background, same beautiful background of those amazing mountains on the Skagit. But yeah, it's upstream a little bit from there. Yeah. And that was originally the Fly Logic ad. Took us 2 weeks to shoot that thing with a crazy guy named Walter Hodges, if any of you know him. But yeah, it's a beautiful river, and that's a beautiful backdrop.
Heck of a photo.
Yeah.
Heck of a cast.
Yeah. It took a while. You know what that cast was? It was off-shoulder snap T.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Yeah. We were doing double spays, getting it, and then the wind blew up river, and compliments to the wind. I mean, man.
How about you, Scott? So it was a rod of George's. That was the first Spey rod that you cast?
Not George's. It was Ed Ward's. It was.
Oh, Ed. Sorry, Ed.
And I still have that rod.
You have that very one? Oh,
I do.
Wow.
And I have the one that Eddie built.
Oh, wow. No kidding.
Remember that one?
Yeah.
Wasn't that the one that got stolen that you got back from the guy at the mouth of Baker who tried to sell it to you?
Oh yeah. See, I forget. I love talking to you guys because you remember stuff that you are reacquainted with things that you totally forgot about. That's right.
Yeah, but that was a 10 weight, 13-foot 10 weight.
10 weight.
And we had a teeny 300 on it. That was our.
Yeah.
But I don't remember overhead casting it that much. I remember us trying to Spey cast it
with Ed's rod that day. Yeah.
Yeah, because and what got us going. I remember Ed spent one full year with it before we poo-pooed it. We were like, that's silly,
Yeah.
Because, we're fishing all together a lot back then. And Ed couldn't fish anywhere or cast any further than we could with our single-handed rods. There's nothing he could do that we couldn't do. And we were totally happy with what we were doing. We were catching fish.
Yeah.
And so was he. But then after that first year, he started being able to, cast from those high bank spots, what we used to call plug water.
Yep.
And that, and he was really getting it done. And we were like, okay, it's time to step it up. And then we started using those rods.
You remember he used to, when the three of us fished, he goes, you guys go ahead. I've got the long rod here. I'll come in behind you because I'm going to fish water you can't. I'm like, okay, thanks, dude.
Yeah, I remember that.
Well, Brian, this might be a great time to tell my story of meeting these two. I think I'd met you when I was working in Kaufman's in, I want to say in the early 80s.
Yeah, probably like 87.
Yeah, yep. But I guided Brian. I ran the Isaac Ranch in eastern Washington over in Douglas County for 29 years before I handed it off to my head guide, Darth Knoble, who's still running it. In fact, I fished it a month ago. And lo and behold, young Scott and Dec booked a trip with me. And I had these two on what we call the upper lake on that ranch. And I got them out there casting single-handers. were probably fishing woolly buggers or chironomids or back and forth. And let me tell you something about these two. A, they could cast, and B, they could swear, because they were both pretty fresh out of the Navy. And, man, they could swear. Nobody had these guys beat on that. And it was about every 7 words. But the coolest thing that happened the day I guided them is that I was almost like a host to them, talking about what they wanted to go do. Scott was freshly out of the Navy. Dec, I think you were at Boeing. Yeah. And those two, about 30 feet apart on the shore of a lake, these two were plotting the Steelhead guide game. They were I got to watch them plot it on a lake in eastern Washington. And these two hauled off. They didn't just talk about it. They made the break. And they talked about the fact that they were going to have to drop what they were doing, make a break for the unknown, and go for it. And by God, they both did it. I mean, they both did it. And I'm not going to tell you I was at the moment where this idea got hatched, because I think it had been hatched probably along with Ed Ward and the three amigos. But I got to see it kind of get out on the table, maybe a little further than it had. And I just stood back and listened to these two. And in between all the swear words, there was some real plotting going on.
That's so cool to hear, because, man, Scott, preceding that trip, I mean, we were just obviously ate up with all this stuff, and we saved our money and went on that thing with you. And I remember Scott and I saying, I'm like, I was intrigued by you because you were somebody that was doing what I wanted to do, and Scott wanted to be in that industry somehow. I remember foaming at the mouth, and we knew that for us to, I remember, if you remember this, I was asking you how you got your start and what you do. I got it in Alaska. I'm like, well, then I'm going to guide Alaska. And recruit steelheaders, and that was pretty cool.
Yeah. George taught us how to double haul that day. We were still very much in the learning phase there, but that was monumental. And Dec picked it up right away too. It took me another month or two to really get it going, but that's where we learned how to double hauls with George.
That is absolutely a fact. Yep, I remember we were on the standing. We were over the water, but we were right there at the top of the upper lake, just below the parking area, right in that first.
You were in the Bay of Pigs, as we call it.
Yeah, and I remember you, and kind of getting it. I had that wiggly old little PAL signature series rod, and you said, son, he's like, he's 30, and I'm 29, or 26. He goes, put this in your hands. And he gave me a 590 RP and Sage RP, and I'm like, oh, man, all day long, I'm like, God, I hope he lets me have this. I'll need that back, Decker.
There was no doubt we were actually way more excited to fish with George to meet him than to fish Isaac Ranch. It was more about being with George. And
yeah, for sure. We watched him on the Kelly Watt video.
That's right.
Yeah, about 20 times.
Didn't they guide with you on Isaac Ranch, George?
Probably.
Dec did. Yeah.
Oh, I did. I started that for years. That was a big gap between my Skagit season and my Alaska season.
You were working there part-time and with Tom, avid angler, as I recall.
Yeah, in the wintertime. But I would go work with George in May. And in the month of May with George at Isaac Ranch, I made more money than I did the whole season in Alaska in 1 month. George is smiling. He knows. That was a cash cow.
You would call me after your sojourn, and you would tell me about the lake steelhead that were hooked in the lower lake. And yeah, well, Brian, I did beat these guys to Alaska. I was guiding the same river system these characters would be on, the Lagnac, and I was there 83, 84, 85, and I was guiding with the likes of Jerry Seam, J.D. Love, just kind of a host of OGs, both in the fly and the gear game, including some longtime Skagit guides that had gotten recruited to Alaska. And it was great, 10 years later, these boys are up there going at it. And I got to fish with them up there. So I kind of came full circle on that river. You brought up Tony Sarp, and he harassed me to come up there and fish. He harassed me so hard, it just fundamentally became easier to say yes than to keep saying no. So, yeah, I got some wonderful years in with Dec up there, and we had a great go of it.
We had some fun.
That's Katmai, right?
He was at Katmai. I was at a Lagneck Lodge, and JD and some of these other guys were at what was called a Branch River Lodge, which was owned by Bob DeVito, Middle River.
So, question for you guys when it comes to Alaska. The episode I initially did with Eric Leininger, and I know everybody knows Eric, how could you not? Eric was a little critical of his initial Alaska experience. He felt that his compensation wasn't at the level it should have been. And, some of the stuff the guy you brought up with, I've heard over the years, is that there's this kind of experience in Alaska as a new guide where you get brought up there with illusions of, catching all these fish. And when you get there, it's chore time. And the compensation on an hourly basis is far less than lower, what you would call minimum wage. Was that your experience? Obviously, there's levels to it, and as you move up through the ranks, you can do better. But for the starting Alaska guide, is it really as bad as they say?
Yes.
Yes.
And then some. First of all, Eric is an angry person to begin with, but
I think since he quit drinking, he's a little bit more upbeat. But
oh yeah, for sure. I just after his presentation at the Spey Claim, any questions? And I said to him, "Ask him why he's so angry." But he quit smoking and drinking. He's chilled out a little bit. But it's all a fun act with him anyway. Just fun. And
we've got to know Eric pretty good over the years. He started out doing a 1 week hosted thing at our lodge here on the Skeena. And this year, I think we're going to see Eric for 4.5 weeks total. So he's, obviously growing his clientele. Everybody likes him. He's a positive guy, but he, he's got a personality that is hard to ignore. And this last show I did with him, which actually comes out before this one will, I had him and a guy named Zach Crothers. Do you guys know Zach? Anybody know Zach?
Oh yeah, I know Zach.
All right. Okay. So this is one of the most interesting stories in fly fishing. Zach was one of the original members of a band called Portugal the Man. They won a Grammy. They had the Song of the Summer in 2017 or something.
Yep.
And Zach gave up the lifestyle of a touring musician to become a beginner fishing guide. So he's in his first year of guiding there in Oregon, taking out the beginners and loving it. So, I had on that show, I had Eric, who's a pretty seasoned guy, and I had Zach, who's pretty new, and it was a good contrast. Joe, I never did ask you, how did you get into Spey casting? When did you first get to cast a two-handed rod?
I would have to say that the first two-handed rod I saw somebody use was probably Harry, and that would have been on the mixer, and we might have all actually been there the same day. And then the first one that I really got close to was Ed's. And
that's three of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we all started the same day.
And like Scott, Ed has bestowed rods upon me as well. I have the 12-4, or that was on that he was fishing on the cover of the Sage catalog, like 96 or something like that. So yeah, so I've gotten a couple of those rods from him, and then I remember early on that we were certainly at that point when I tried the rod that Ed had. It had a 10 weight double taper with a sink tip, and then pretty rapidly everybody, with one exception, went to the heads. Harry and Bob were working with Jimmy Green in the development of these rods, and George probably has much more background information on what was happening inside Sage, but they really promoted the concept of the head, and that is the direction that I think everybody's gone in now. And certainly, I think a lot of that had to do with exactly what Dec and Scott were relating to. Fishing on the high side of the river when so many people are on the side that, we normally swing from, gave you access to other fish, and the head is really the best way to do that. So that was my experience. And then I went on to work with, as I said in the earlier conversation with you, Brian, had limited interaction with the industry, so to speak, although I imported stuff for Bruce and Locker and now. That's how it went. And I ran into these guys frequently. I have a fond memory of before we actually all went to the double-handed rod, meeting Scott in the parking lot there at the end of the road to go into the mixer, and he was we were in his van tying flies, and then we went out onto the mixer. And we were all talking about whether he and I were talking about whether 7100 was good enough, because there was a conversation about whether it was really important to go to a double-handed rod. Well, time has proven it was.
Nice. And it's interesting for me to hear, that Ed Ward was kind of at the beginning of this story for most of you, wasn't he?
He had the rod.
Now, I think it's important to say, he didn't start the Spey rod experience on the Skagit, right? He got it from like Joseph's Harry Lemire and Mike Kinney and Albert and so there was and Strobel. So there was that small handful of guys, John Farrar, that started it. Maybe a couple of years before that, and it was their influence that got him started on it.
And up here, Mike Maxwell is a big part of that story in Canada. And I was very fortunate. My first guiding on the Skeena system was for Mike and Denise, and this would have been like probably about 1998. And at that point, Mike was using pretty big stuff still. He was using like 15-foot 8 weights and 9 weights, those Tiger Eye blanks. So really soft, full flexing rods. But, Mike, I don't know if you guys knew Mike, but Mike was pretty set in his ways, very opinionated guy, but in a lot of ways ahead of his time. And the year I worked for him, he was filming a lot of video, him and Denise, and they were doing these VHS, casting videos that they would push out into the world. And I have that stuff. I just don't have a VCR to watch it anymore. But it was fascinating to think that over time, George, we talked in the last episode, we would see these rods get shorter, right? And we would see the lines get shorter. And you made a great point, and I've actually brought it up to people a couple times since then. You said that there were great rods that Sage made that were probably underappreciated at the time because we just didn't have the right lines for them to shine.
Yeah, no doubt. There was, this whole little sequence. I had hardly been around the rods. In his first year rep for Sage, Dec, Scott, Joe, I'm sure you guys hadn't heard this one, but you'll probably like it. Gary Sandstrom, who owned the Morning Hatch in Tacoma, asked me one day when I was calling on him, can you teach a Spey class? And before my brain really engaged, I said yes. And he would book it, and we did it on the upper Puyallup in a particular spot that wasn't a bad river left spot. And before the class, number one, I had to come up with some rods. And so I had X amount of largely 14 for 9s, probably a 15 for 10, and maybe something out of the European basket that was shorter, 12 something, 8 weight. And then coming up with lines was like pulling teeth. Double taper 10 if you could find something, double taper 9, triangle taper, 2-handed line, I remember, which was probably the best casting one right at that moment. And I'd hardly cast, much less teach. But I signed up for this. So my antidote to get ready for the class was on the Friday before the Saturday class. I drove from my house in Paulsbo over to the Sage factory. I sauntered into the president's office, Bruce Kirshner, and I said, hey, man, I know there's a tape laying around here, Hugh Falkus on casting. And he goes, yeah, let me go find it. And he brings it to me. I go home. I watch Hugh Falkus from 3:30 to 4:29 on Hugh Falkus on casting. At 4:30 to 5:29, I watch it a second time, and I go teach a class the next day. And I got enough out of it with the single Spey and the double that I was able to go function with these characters. You know, what do they call it? Fake it till you make it. That was probably a pretty early rendition. But, I mean, the rods, you know, yeah, I knew Mike Maxwell because I saw him at all the shows. And Mike was an imposing figure, just physically, as well as that booming voice and that ever-booming opinion. And he lived and died on those monster rods. But as time would go by, yeah, we had some fabulous rods at Sage. 9126 in the original GFL, we had various stuff, 12-foot 8 weights, 12-foot 4, 8124, I can remember. And we just didn't have the lines to support these things. You know, if we had the lines that we had just 20 years ago, much less today, we'd have been in just insanely good business as casters, as promoters. I was just on the Umpqua the last 2 days, lower Umpqua at Reedsport, fishing stripers. And I was fortunate enough that I hooked 8, landed all of them. And I'd fished down there in the early 1980s with the dean of striper guides in Oregon, a guy named Denny Hanna, who put me onto all sorts of these things. And I couldn't catch my ass with both hands. We didn't have the lines. We barely had some flies. And we had floating fly lines, and I didn't catch single striper on those 2 days with that guy, and there were giants in there then. And I go down there on this trip, and I got a striper sink tip, and I've got an intermediate outbound, and I've got this, and I've got that. Hell, I'm equipped to the teeth. And because of that, and flies, you know, that are newfangled, this, that, and the other. But it was, you know, I was in on all sorts of stuff that was infancy that we look back on now and just go, God, if we'd only had this. I mean, I think about Dec. One of the things I saw with Dec and Ed and Scott in those early years, late 80s, early 90s, is we'd all kind of run around with a little packet of photos. You know, the original Instagram was a bunch of photos, and these guys were no exception. And I remember one session that the three of them, and I think, Dec, you were the one who had them, but it was largely of you three and a Jerry French photo, you know, dropped in there. And it was just you guys holding one slob steelhead after another, just one after another. And it was like some big dollies. I remember Ed showing me a picture of what looked like a 12, 13-pound dolly from the Skagit, or maybe the Sauk, or, you know, somewhere up there. But these guys, Brian, they weren't just talking about it. They were doing it, and they had the photos to prove it.
Hit that 1 hour photo, man. Get off the river. Go right to the photo. Speaking of that, I remember, this is a George thing, that I forget when, but I caught a good sized fish on the Skagit, and I called George. You know, I was just new to it and all ate up, and I said, man, George, I got a big one. And he goes, how big? I said, I don't know, 13 or 14 pounds. And he goes, I thought you said big. I since have come to appreciate where you were coming from, but to me, it was ginormous at that time.
Not many companies are building their own gear these days, but Intrepid Camp Gear is changing that. Based in Boulder, Colorado, Intrepid designs and manufactures some of the most rugged, technically advanced rooftop tents and aluminum cargo cases on the market. Their gear is built in-house with patented designs that stand up to the elements and the miles. Whether you're chasing elk deep in the backcountry, hunting for fresh powder, or heading out for your next fly fishing trip, Intrepid gives you the confidence to go further. Their rooftop tents keep you warm, dry, and off the ground. Their cargo cases, bomb-proof, weather-tight, and ready for just about anything. So stop settling for flimsy, mass-produced gear. Level up with the gear that's built to last and engineered for real adventure. Go to wetflyswing.com/intrepid right now to get started. That's INTREPID. Intrepid Camp Gear. Get started right now.
Do you guys think that social media and Instagram in particular has really screwed things up, or do you think it's good because it inspires people to get out and fish more?
Who goes first?
Boy.
I'll take this one.
Okay, you guys go.
Sorry, we're ready to do it.
Oh,
I think that social media, so I'll just say this. I think that people like George and Dec and Scott are full-time professionals. There are guys like me and others like me that have been involved in this, since we all started together and have chosen, we have a different path, but we were all connected by fish. And instilling that connection and the appreciation for the resource in the client and those that are around you is sort of the role of mentorship that these guys take on with hundreds of people a year. That, to me, is a very personal thing, and that is lost when all you see is a picture on Instagram or there's a soundbite and you're talking about it. And I don't think it's a replacement. I think it's great advertising, but I don't think it's a replacement for how we appreciate the resource. And if, in reverse, it brings people to where we're all fishing and they get to have that experience with us, well, then we then have to think about maybe how our role changes a little bit. I don't know. That's my opinion.
I have mixed feelings about it. It helps me with my business. I can tell you that. And what I do now, it just keeps you kind of relevant and out there. And it's a super way to communicate. Like you asked at the beginning of this. So you said, Brian, at the end, you can get a chance to give your contact info, whatever you want. Well, my contact info is, Dec Hogan and Instagram. Anybody in the world can reach me, right? Without giving out phone numbers and emails. And as regards putting people on the water, yeah, I think it's exponentially changed things since back when we were doing it prior to internet. I remember one guy whom we all know, I won't say his name, but he was up on that Skagit sock system, and he was the very first person that we knew that was posting on the internet about what was going on the river. And he posted a daily journal, and I remember it drove us crazy. I can speak for at least Ed and I and Scott. I couldn't believe what this guy was sharing with people, and it was putting people on the water. And I thought, why would you do that? And we're all promoters of the sport, but that was something new, and it was intrusive, and it was ugly. And now at least people aren't always naming names and where they are. A lot of people are protective of that. But, a lot of these places, you can tell where they are. Doesn't mean that someone's going to go and catch all your fish, but it brings people to the river. Absolutely. Anyway, and then, we can joke about, well, we could say that about anything. It's not just fishing, right? There's all kinds of activities, whether it be mountain biking or hiking in the alpine meadows or golfing or what have you, where it has effect on resources by bringing more people. Social media has undoubtedly changed the face of that landscape, outdoor recreation, among others. But
it definitely has changed my outlook on what we used to call the Roderick Haig Brown factor, right? Dec and I used to talk about this all the time, the Roderick Haig Brown factor. Of course, we're promoting ourselves and our guide service, and so we're promoting our rivers. I remember, when they closed the Skagit and I moved to the Oregon coast, and I told Mike, I started working with Mike McCune, and we started doing shows together, and we started doing all this stuff together, promoting our guide services down there on the coast. And I told him, I said, look, this is going to be the new Skagit. I said, in 10 years, because there was nobody down there. I mean, guys were floating the very lower section of those rivers, and all the rivers down there, upper reaches that with the good fly water, it was empty. We were floating those rivers every day by ourselves. I mean, there was just nobody. And I told him, I said, we're going to be promoting this and we're going to change it. In 10 years, it's going to be crowded here. It's going to be, and it was right up at about 10 years. But, we used to call it the Roderick Haig Brown factor where, and I think that social media changed that. The Roderick Haig Brown factor is this. He would tell everybody everything, right? He'd be on the Campbell and he'd be, catching kings on dry flies or something. And he would go and tell, it wasn't kings on dries, but, steelhead on dry, head drift in the B, right? And he would go tell everybody this, and he would tell them where he caught him, this exact spot, and what time of day, and exactly how to do it. And every day he would go to those spots, and he'd expect to see somebody there because he gave out all the information, but he'd never see anybody. And so you're telling this your secrets, your fishing secrets, but nobody's taking advantage of it, right? And we saw that pre-internet, and so we were really free with all our information because of Roderick.
Let me interject there, Scott. If you remember, Haig Brown also said that we had a moral and ethical obligation as anglers to share information.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yep.
And we believed in that.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were kind of silly, fluffy guys. We'd get on the riverbank and read to each other sometimes. I would one day go, Ed, I have some stuff I want to read to you. And we sat on the riverbank and I'm reading from a Haig Brown book to Ed. And then you and I did at the house all the time. That's kind of shaped and molded us.
I think it's a full mixed bag. There's no doubt it's put bodies on the river. It's put bodies into certain sections of rivers, watersheds of all type. But on the other hand, it's allowed a messaging, right? The Spey Clave we just all three of us spoke at, it was a great enabler of getting the word out for that. And I'm rather sure that of those 400 people that showed up in those 2 days, if there was a way to survey them all, I would imagine most, if not damn near all of them, were touched in some form or format by a social media post on that. I think maybe the coolest, I can certainly harp on it, both from a fishing and hunting perspective, because it's impacted hunting, which is far more pressure sensitive than any fishing ever thought about being. But it's allowed us to meet people that you randomly might have no shot ever meeting. Somebody from Michigan, tying flies, somebody, in Argentina with something to offer. It's a great meeting place. And from that perspective, I think it continues to be pretty fascinating. I bass fished 2 places this year, one in California on Clear Lake, and I'm going to fish a lake near one of my deer leases in Texas in October. And they're both with guides that I probably could have never stumbled into without some form or fashion of seeing something they were up to on Instagram. So there's some great opportunity that comes out of that. And it's going to be a pro-con thing, I think, forevermore, right, boys?
Yep.
I want to go back to the book for a second, because you talked about Haig Brown, and obviously Haig Brown's probably the most important person in Canadian fly fishing history. Maybe it goes beyond that. And
definitely does.
Yeah, you guys were inspired, right? You guys were inspired.
Yep.
And then, move this forward a little bit, and Dec, A Passion for Steelhead, the very comprehensive book. You didn't miss anything in there. There's people who read that book and were inspired and go back and refer to it, right? And, nowadays, I don't know if Instagram replaces that, but it's doing the same thing, right? It's inspiring people to get out there, which is good. Obviously, the danger is the information can travel a little bit too fast in real time. But one of the neat things, and I said this at the beginning of an event like the Spey Clave you guys just attended, someone's reading their book. You're inspiring them they're reading your book. You're inspiring them to get out there and do this. And they show up at a Spey Clave and get to actually meet you. That's pretty freaking cool, right? And has there been anyone for you guys that, in your time that was essentially, I don't want to say hero might not be the right word, but anyone who really inspired you in the early days that you got to meet later on or even fish with?
I got one. Joe Brooks. So I learned to fly fish when I was 11 years old. My first day of fly fishing was on the Henry's Fork in Idaho as an 11-year-old. And needless to say, I lost all my green drake dries to some awfully good rainbows that day. And I had these Joe Brook books that my dad let me read his. And then he bought me one summer called Joe Brooks Trout Fishing. And that same summer, I'm sitting in a restaurant with my parents in Last Chance, Idaho, and there's Joe Brooks sitting at a table across from us. And my dad just kind of looked at me and nodded. And I dashed my little butt out to the car, got that book, came in, walked up to him and asked him to autograph it, and he did. And I mean, just the randomness of the whole thing, right? But no, that was a huge thing. And I look back at that as an 11-year-old kid reading his stories, striper fishing in Oregon, which is what led me to even go down there was him talking about it, this, that, and the other. So, yeah, it's just those are fabulous stories. I can't wait to hear some more right now.
I've been very fortunate to have met some and hung out with some great steelhead fishermen. And I think before I hung out with Harry or, and fished with him on the Thompson and whatnot, I was really influenced by Lee Wolf. And I was very interested in his herring flies. And I was able to, I took an Atlantic salmon fishing class with Lee Wolf. And for some reason, I was eaten up with Atlantic salmon fishing, and I actually called the house a couple of times after the fact, and he picked up the phone and talked to me as if, here's this young kid that's really interested in it. And I saw him at a couple of shows and, really changed my perspective on all this stuff because I had this, and I still hold this belief that, experimentation is going to lead to something that will, make you better. And that was sort of the takeaway that I had from him, because he instilled this sense of confidence in doing that, doing the abnormal, whether it was a short rod or whether it was no rod at all, whether it was, dry flies, tiny waking dry flies, tiny dead drift dry flies, or how it translated to what we had on the Stilly with, Walt Johnson and Mike Kinney and others, with these tiny waking dry flies. And, and then that had, so early on that had a profound impact on me, to the point that I called George one day and I said, George, you guys have a 7-foot 4.5 RP. You probably don't remember this, George, but you pulled the rod aside. And I came to your office. I can't remember where it was. It might have been out on Baybridge. And I picked up the rod here, and I went down and lived my Lee Wolf moment. I went down to the Klamath. I put a muddler minnow on. I was fishing with Kevin Perkins, a name you all remember. And this steelhead, like the first day I have the rod, the steelhead takes my fly. And all I remember is strip, because the fly went straight stream. So it had a tremendous impact.
My Lee Wolf moment, I remember I was influenced a bit by Lee Wolf because of you. I knew who he was prior to that and everything, but you're intrigued because I thought you were pretty cool back then. I later came to learn, the truth, but I thought you were pretty cool. By the way, Scott and Ed, or Scott and Ed, but Scott and Joe were with me the evening that I caught my very first steelhead on a two-handed rod, and which is kind of cool and a forever moment. So thanks, guys. Good memories. I think that night we all caught something, but it was my first one on a two-hander. And I can tell you how far back it goes. I was still, I was in the Navy with Scott, and I worked on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier, and my turtleneck shirt under my shirt is a flight deck jersey in the photo. So kind of cool. Yeah, yeah. But my Lee Wolf moment, just for fun, quick, was I know, Lee cast. I think all of us can cast a line without a rod, right? We can all do that. And I had fun and did it quite a bit just for fun. And I thought, man, Lee Wolf did it on the water. I'm going to go do that. And I went up to one of those bars on the Lagnac and was going to catch chum salmon without a rod. So I tucked that reel in my pocket in my waders, and I was a pretty proud rodless caster. And I tell you what, out on the water, no can do. I couldn't do it. I tried and I tried and I tried, and I could not cast that fly and deliver it on the water without a rod. So kudos to Lee Wolf. The person I met that was greatly an influence. Yeah, we all say Harry Lemire and those guys, but they were right there. I was by them already. But as far as somebody whom I looked up to and influenced me that I finally got to meet was Bill McMillan. I read all his stuff and was intrigued with him and down the Washougal River and all his exploits with the dry line and surface flies and all that good stuff. And I actually wrote him a letter, a handwritten letter, and didn't know who to mail it to. So I don't know where it went. I was very young then. I wish I still had it. But all of a sudden, one day, I'm guiding on the Grand Ronde River that George hooked me up with, and I think 91 was my first year there. And Bill McMillan was brought in to do his dryline steelhead school. I was just floored. So I'm taking my clients to watch Bill McMillan all morning long put on his little clinic and show all those techniques that I read about. And then I would take the clients out in the afternoon. We would practice the methods that he taught us. But I'll never forget the first day. He goes, "Hey, we got a day off. Should we go fishing, Dec?" What? You would actually fish with me? And we went out, and that guy, he fished that dry fly all day long. And he caught 6 fish that day on the dry line, on the floating fly. Half of them were dead drifted. So that everything that I was intrigued about him all came to fruition, and by gosh, it was true. So that was my moment. And then meeting Scott and George and Joe was also, and now today you, Brian, I've watched your exploits over the years because why? Social media. I wouldn't know who you were without social media at this point in the game for me. Yeah.
And I've come to really pull back a little bit from social media myself. I feel like I just don't really know what the heck I'm doing. I got a young guy that works for us, Esteban. He makes our videos that you see on Instagram and stuff. And you guys talked before about this network that one can create online. And, this kid's got friends all over the world that he's never met in person, but they're good friends and they interact. It's a real friendship and they collaborate on things creatively. And yeah, I haven't made an Instagram post in a long time for the business because I just get him to do it. Because honestly, full disclosure, I hate the
yeah, right.
I absolutely hate the but I do recognize the power of it. And like you said, Dec, it's from a business standpoint, it makes it so easy. George, what about you?
So in I think it was October of 1984, it was a 22-page article in Sports Illustrated about Christmas Island. It was 22 pages, not whole pages, but it was 22 pages. And I don't remember who wrote it, but I damn sure remember by the time I finished reading it, I had to go to Christmas Island. And I would go in March of 1985, which was pretty early on in the game. In fact, Randall Kaufman only beat me there by 3 weeks. But 2 key factors to my trip, had I not heard them from a couple of legends, I'd have been completely lost upon arriving on the island. And one thing was Andre Pouillons from California. He told me, whatever I did, don't take gray sunglasses. He said, you better find a pair of yellow or amber. He said, you'll need that to see these fish. He said, if you have gray, like bonefish, you'll never see them. You'll never see them. And so I managed to get a pair of teeny locators, Jim Teeny locators in amber. Oh, yeah, man. And I saw fish, right? And then the other guy that inspired on that trip was Mel Krieger. He told me what flies to tie. Little Crazy Charlies. He said tie a yellow body with a white rabbit wing with a little bit of pearl flash blue and tie a a clear body with a tan calf tail. And he said, just take those two. Well, by God, I tied away. But had I not run into those guys, which both of them were at the Seattle Sports Show, I believe in the Kingdom. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was in the Kingdom. Had I not talked to those two guys, I'd have showed up at Christmas Island probably with some who knows what flies, who knows what sunglasses. I wouldn't have gotten all stupid done. And so those type encounters of yesteryear are potentially daily encounters for any of us today on Instagram. So in a way, those random meetings were just that. They were random, right? But they were so informative and so helpful. And now some of that stuff, I'm sure I'll check one of my two feeds. I've got two of them, a hunting one, a fishing one. I'll see something that's cool. I'll see something that's informative. I'll see something I didn't know. Yeah, because I can't imagine if I'd have shown up at Christmas Island with gray sunglasses, what an unmitigated disaster that would have been.
Talk to us, Scott.
Well, first of all, Joe mentioned Kevin Perkins, and I want to say that meeting Joe and Kevin Perkins was really special to me because those guys founded the Seattle Atlantic Salmon Fly Tying Guild, and their flies were on a level that I had just never seen before. Not in a book or anywhere. I just never seen anything like those flies, and that was inspirational. But as far as idolizing anglers and then meeting them, I mean, there's two that come to mind that would be hard to pit against each other. One was, Dec and I were headed to the Upper Sauk, and we were going to launch in Darrington. And I don't know if that was the first time we ever did that, but it was close to it. And we ran into Harry Lemire on the way. And, it was, we were giddy just to talk to the guy. But Dec, had the gonads to just walk up to the guy and say, hey, we're going to float the Upper Sauk. You want to come with us? And he said yes.
Never turned down a chance to go fishing.
That's right. And so that was an amazing day that I will never forget. And of course, he caught two and we caught none. But there were lessons to be had there that I still talk about to this day. And then, of course, the other one is it was also with Dec. We had just got our Steelhead Shangri-La books, and we went and knocked on Ralph Wall's door to get them autographed. And he invited us down to his basement. That was easily the most magical non-fishing day of my life. That was incredible.
Odie.
We got to listen to. He had a giant filing cabinet, right? That was completely full of hundreds of cassette tapes. Those guys, they didn't have YouTube. So they took a tape recorder with them, and they would record on a cassette tape their fishing day. And so he put one in and we sat there and listened to it with Ralph Wall, of Ralph Wall and Enos Bradner fishing Mystery Lake in British Columbia. It was unbelievable. You could hear the creaking of the oars.
The fluke reel.
That's right.
I got goosebumps, Scott.
Yeah.
He had that one that he set to music, and it sounded like old-timey Disney music frolicking through the forest. And it was him reading from his journal. April 19th, 1952. It was a fine day at Grandy Creek Riffle. I landed 3 steelhead, one of 18 pounds, 2 of 14. Remember that? That was great. I had recorded all that and I had lost it. I don't know where it is, but that was a magic day. And he gave us each a fly.
Yep.
And I believe that the photo I took of him was the last photo of him that was published. And it was in that Skagit River Journal. Yeah. And bless his heart, I remember we cropped it out because he had gravy on his shirt from his Salisbury steak that his lady made him. Awesome, Scott.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. I wonder where those tapes are today, eh?
I hope they didn't get tossed out.
No, they didn't. You can actually go listen to them. They're at I forget where it is. It's somewhere in
the museum.
This guy Sam Roca. Speaking of social media, I can contact him because I'd love to see him. There's some library, maybe in Vancouver, that has all of that stuff, and you can listen to all of it.
I want to thank you, Scott, for your kind words about that period of time. But I think I need to say this with all of you guys on the call, and that is that for as much as you might have been inspired by the flies that we were tying, I will tell you there was one fly. I might get emotional telling you this, dude, because we talked about it. But there are a lot of people who, especially when you're young and you're steelhead fishing, you really focus on, all right, what fly are they going to take? You really think that the fly is probably the most important thing because that's what they connect themselves to. And Kevin and I used the Sock Scott religiously for a couple of seasons because we'd be on the mixer at different times. We'd run into each other at different times. And so this is a fly. Scott, you should give everybody the recipe if they don't know it. And there was a way to fish the fly, which, in the evening required using a photo flash to activate, the bioluminescent body so that fish in waning light, chromers coming in from the sea and the waning light would see that fly. But the influence goes both ways, my friend. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Very cool. So I was with Joe. We had been up there a couple times when the Skagit's been open. When I was just up there 2 months ago with Joe, and he was fishing his version of the Sock Scott still. And Kevin, speaking of Kevin Perkins, he was also there that night that I got that first steelhead on the two-hander. And I have one of Kevin's flies. I never really put it together till just this moment. And it's the color theme of the Sock Scott.
The green, blue, and purple.
Yep.
And the tide, the inspiration, we were all using them. We called them marabous, right? They were George Cook's popsicle series that he had come up with fishing the Alagnac earlier in the 80s. And everybody was using marabous. And nowadays they call them Spey flies. But this marabous wrapped on a hook. And, it's so funny. At that time, the development of flies, there were rules. And we were constantly breaking those rules. I remember when Hogan first tied a purple and yellow marabou. And everybody was just disgusted by this fly. Purple and yellow? You can't put purple and yellow together. This has never been happening. It looks horrible, right?
Yeah.
Now it looks beautiful to me, right? Because it works. But I remember, learning, for dirty water, the last colors that a fish can see before he loses all color is green and blues and greens, right? But the color that we were catching so many fish on was purple, and especially the gentian violet, right? And so I wanted to mix that with Kelly green because I wanted to use glow in the dark flashaboo. And I wanted to put that on the Kelly green back end. And I couldn't put green and purple together. It just clashed, right? It went against, I wasn't willing to go there that far outside the box to put green and purple in the same fly. So I bridged it with blue in the middle. And that's the Sock Scott story.
And you got fish on it the first night you used it.
You gave me one, Scott, and I remember looking at it thinking probably Chinooks would eat this. I remember you talking about the colors. These would be the last ones to fade out. And, of course, this was all making sense in your world because you had coined the phrase, I'm fishing plug water now. And, and so it made a lot of sense. One of my great fly encounter stories was with a guy that you guys all know well, Scott Howe.
Oh, yeah.
You guys guided with him on the Alagnac, and he was guiding on the Umpqua one year for old Jim Van Loan at Steamboat Inn. And I was one of the few reps who actively called on Steamboat Inn, largely because with Jim Van Loan, you always learned something. Could be about fishing or history or some world news or event. He was fascinating to be around. And Scott guided for him one year. And I was working for Solitude Fly Company at the time. And Scott came in the library there to meet with me. And Scott started out the conversation with, George, I just couldn't decide at this meeting if I want to beat the shit out of you or I want to hand you some flies. And I put out my hands because anybody who's been around Scott Howell, Dec, you told me one of the great stories of all time about him hauling a motor by himself down a dock. Scott Howell's the size of an NFL linebacker and a Division I college one, by the way, too, not NIAI. and I thought, holy shit, I'm fixing to get beat up here in the Steamboat Inn. And he says to me, he goes, I'm bringing you my flies. He said, there's all these versions of an Adams. There's an Adams standard. There's a female Adams. There's an Adams parachute. There's an Adams this. And he said, there might as well be a bunch of versions of intruders. And I'm giving you mine to put into Solitude. And he handed them to me. And they were all the OG gangsters, all the colors. And I would get them into Solitude, lickety split, and proceed to sell a metric ton of them. But it was quite a moment where I was wondering if I was going to make it back to my car. Yeah.
Sounds about it.
There's a great intruder story.
Mm-hmm.
There's been so much focus on everything Skagit. Skagit lines, intruders, all this stuff. I think that we were all very fortunate to be at that place, bumping into each other. And there were piles of influences that came out in different ways. And the zeitgeist of Skagit is the proving ground or the, I don't know, help me out, you guys. It's sort of it was the melting pot for so much of what modern steelhead fishing is today. And I don't feel as though anybody has a monopoly on that. I feel as though it was the outgrowth of these different little tributaries, all of which we represent a different part, from clearly George's popsicles and how those evolved into the things that we just talked about today. I get goosebumps now when I think about how we were all sort of, telling that or evolving that story through this moment in this call.
Definitely a collective process. Yep. Pretty cool. Thank you.
Joseph, we talked the other day about, the importance of some locations as gathering points. And, the one that I always think of to bring it back up here in Canada is of course, Spence's Bridge, the Thompson. You'd meet people from all over the world at that time of year and, the shared human experience and, see what everybody else was up to. I've heard it alluded to as the World Series of steelheading, but maybe that's a silly way to put it. I don't know. What's you guys' thoughts? What other places have been important in the history? Obviously, we talked about the Skagit. What else has there been?
Got to throw that in there. The California boys, right? Mike Kennedy's and those guys down there, fishing the Klamath and the Trinity and
Eel.
And,
Yeah.
And the southern Oregon coast rivers, there was that group down there, sure, too, Elk.
Heller's Bar on the Grand Ron.
The Klamath.
The Fortson Hole on the North Fork of the Steelhead.
Hey, yeah, there you go. No doubt. No doubt. You'd show up there in a who's who. Good point.
Down. The picnic table just downstream from it.
Right.
Yep, that's where you went when the Fortson Hole got too crowded.
Getting that, and you'd get in a lineup. Even there.
Yeah.
I think, though, that I would change the definition of the Thompson. I would say the Thompson is the Super Bowl of steelhead fly fishing. The rocks, the fish, the fact that they like floating lines, and every time you hook one, it's jumping upstream because it's taking your entire line across the river, and that giant river has changed the angle to pull on that fish. You don't see it You're looking downstream, you see that out of the corner of your eye the first time it jumps. That, and then you have to decide, what are you going to do? You're going to hold your ground, or what are you going to do? And then I think there's been a lot of other places that are like the Pro Bowl, meaning that you have different groups of seasoned anglers that know that place and they show up, whether it's, the Umpqua, whether it's, Howard Miller Steelhead Park, whether it's, the list goes on. But,
Grand Ron.
Yeah, so the mouth of the Ron, that's that Heller's Bar, man. We're down in there. Everyone shows up. It seems like most of the name brand, if you will, steelhead rivers have that one or two spots, the Potato Patch on the Kispiox, the Ben Howard on the Skycomish back in the day.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep. Fortune Hole. Sock Bar. Well, we called it Sock Bar, the mixer.
So, Brian, can I ask you a question?
Please do.
Your most memorable fish?
My most memorable fish? Well, landed or lost?
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
I got one that sticks with me. And it's, I was fortunate enough. We talked about this in the episode we did before. It's, George, you've helped a lot of people along. Kenny Morris, blames you for putting him in Oregon in a good way. Trevor Kovich, you got him started guiding in Alaska, out on the Sandy. And I'm sure the list goes on. But I got my opportunity to go to the Connect Talk because of you. And you get a lot of positive reinforcement on the Connect Talk. There's a lot of connections there. You see the fish blub. You can grow as a Chinook angler pretty quickly there. And previous to that, I'd fished a river called the Lillooet. And the Lillooet might be the coolest Chinook river going. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but it's a big river at the north end of Harrison Lake. So these fish come up the Fraser, they go up the Harrison River, they go through Harrison Lake, and then they're in the Lillooet. So these fish are quite a ways inland, but they come in early. They come out of the ocean in February. That's right, February and March. So we're fishing these fish in like late March, April, maybe a little bit into May. These are pre-freshet Chinook in a system that has a couple giant lakes. And what's going to happen is after these fish go through the Lillooet, they're going to go up into Lillooet Lake, and then from there they'll go into a river called the Birkenhead, and they will actually spawn in August and September. So these fish are in freshwater a long time. So, there's not huge numbers of them, but that's where I really got, the first Chinook I ever landed on the fly was in the Lillooet, and it was chrome bright, and I caught it on a big giant blue, I called it a sea creature, this big thing made out of llama hair, if you can imagine. So there's that. That's the most incredible one I've landed. But the one that got away I've never forgotten was when we could fish the Skeena for Chinook. I hooked a fish, and I never saw the thing. It cleaned out a hatch 12 from the take. To this day, I don't know if it was just a really angry 40-pounder or I mean, we get some big ones here, right? But I never saw this thing, and I've never, ever forgot that. And those are my two. First Chinook landed and that one that got away that I never got a chance to see.
Nice.
Well, I've got two great ones that involve two of the five guys sitting here, three, including me. So I hooked a fish on Zubar one year with Dec, and on a Spey rod, I think it might have been a 9140, maybe a 10160, and this fish made it to what we call Coffin Corner on Zubar, which means you're either getting in a boat or you're kissing all your goodbye. It's A or B. And Dec and I got in a boat and chased this fish. And this fish, and we saw it, Dec, you'll recall it. It came out of the water, and both of us went 50 plus.
Yep.
We got that fish off 7 root wad snags, and on number 8, we lost it. And so, but it was quite a story. And then a different year, Scott, I was in a boat with you and Brian O'Keefe. We went down to Manhattan Beach, which is right where she dumps into the Delta. And Scott, you hooked a fish out of the boat, and that fish breached. And I remember saying to you and Brian, 52, 54, and that thing got off, and it was just like those giant ones they won most of the battles, but it was great to see them. And it was great to see them with guys like you guys because it made it all the more memorable both then and now.
Yeah. You remember I launched you guys up onto a gravel bar that day when I was trying to put some shit in the jet boat. And you were bragging on me because I'd done it once already that day, and I went over this dry bar. I'd push a wave up over this little dry bar and just rode the wave over the bar. And I remember George looking to Brian O'Keefe and going, "That's a lagnac train." And then I was going to do it again later in the day, and I totally messed it. It would just put us high and dry up on this bar. We had to push that boat off that bar. That was that day. Oh, that's funny.
Lagnac training. I have a bunch of them. Well, first of all, that's kind of cool that for as much as you've kingfished, George, that your two most memorable moments were with Scott and I. And I distinctly, I could still picture that whole thing that we did running down that thing. It just made me think about it. One of my fun experiences was with a Chinook, a king. And I'm throwing this in because we're talking kings, but we used to, on the Lagnac after hours, we would go, a bunch of us would get in a boat, and like probably 6 of us, way too many. And that was part of the game. And we called it No Pussies. I wrote about it. I called it No Wimps, but we called it No Pussies. And we'd go fish for jacks in the spot where the jacks would load up. And what were they, 5 to 15 pounds, whatever, 5 to 10 pounds. And No Pussies was, we were on anchor and using single-handed rods. And no matter what that fish did, you weren't allowed to pull the anchor, right? No Pussies. And we went out there a few nights and did it. And we had some fun antics. And one night, thwack, I hit this fish. And it just takes off ripping. And I'm going, boys. And they're like, no pussies, Dec, no pussies. And I distinctly remember this thing came out of the water. Like, I like the term breach for a big king salmon. Full breach. And those guys were like, get the anchor, pull the anchor. I didn't have to say anything. They saw that fish and the chase was on. I was using the 8100 RPL. We chased this thing all over the place and laughed, and I got it in and we weighed it. It was 46 pounds.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So that was a fun one for me with a Chinook. Bunches more.
Well, Brian, the Lagnac, when I was guiding the Lagnac, 83, 84, 85, and I felt like this because I fished it in the early 90s up until 95, I felt there were weeks within the Chinook run where 1 in 8 fish landed was over 40 pounds. 1 in 8. And we didn't see, but maybe I don't know how many you guys saw over 50. I didn't see but 1 or 2 in those years, but it was incredible the level of them that were over 40 within, the sample group. A lot of people don't know this or remember this, but the Naknak had the highest number of fish, over 50, was actually the Naknak. By far the most, over 50. And in the Nushagak, which had the most fish, had very, very few over 40. Yeah, I think I saw 1 or 2 one summer when they had me stuffed out there for the whole event. So, yeah, the 50-pound king, outside of the Kenai and probably, the Skeena and the Columbia proper back in the, early 1900s. It's a rare bird, man. It's a rare critter.
Oh, yeah.
Rare critter.
Yep. On the Alagnac, I saw they were gear caught by our guides. Herb Jacobson came in one day with a 62 on the Alagnac, weighing at the dock. You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
And then I think John Clark's got one that was 60 or 61 once. It was massive. And, that's all meat and stuff. But one thing I loved about the Connect Talk, the few times I fished it for kings, is I like the size because they were somewhat manageable.
20, 25.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, you joined us a little late, but we're happy that you made it. But we haven't talked about your art, and I think we should take a few minutes here and talk about what you do. I've been checking out your website. It's pretty damn cool, and I know you've got a fish-related project on the go right now. Can we discuss that?
Yeah. So I would not be making the art that I make if it were not for steelhead fishing and not for developing a healthy respect for places through which steelhead rivers go. I mean, there are places like in the Palouse or, in the Okanagan where we have steelhead, but a temperate rainforest, like a river going through a temperate rainforest, these chrome bright creatures in that temperate rainforest, the sort of like the brooding clouds that permeate the valleys of those forests that we get to like hang out in and swing flies for those majestic creatures. That is, hopefully I've successfully conveyed that mood to whoever's listening to this. That is the impetus behind why I do what I do. And I've been here fishing since 1987 and for steelhead. And I wanted to be able to use my voice as an artist to bring people together for the benefit of the fish and those forests. So I started a project called the Salmon School in 2019. And the goal was to get a group of people together to make something out of glass, a school of salmon out of glass. Glass is, fragile and transparent, reflective, and then mirror these fish that are made by contributors from around the world, then assemble them in a school in a quantifiable space like a basketball court and show the world what an endless resource looks like. And travel this around the world and show people what an endless resource looks like. And then have youth go out on streams with, scientists and indigenous people and others and learn, what's really there. And then tell us the story of what's happening in that big, bright, shiny object made of many chrome salmon. So that's sort of my way of giving back to this place that has fed me as far as my art's concerned. So it is an experience. It's a conceptual endeavor, and it was first exhibited at the Belvoir Museum. Then it went on to the United Nations Global Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, where it hung over 100% of the international delegates and heads of state that could make a difference for salmon and steelhead around the world. And then subsequently it's been to, Balmoral Castle. I got to fish at Balmoral, Scott. And then, and it's been to a number of other places like Macallan Distillery on the Spey, and most recently was exhibited at the Museum of Glass, and it will be shown in part at the Gail Severin Gallery in Ketchum, Idaho I think opens the 7th of August, and it'll be there for a couple of months. So that's what I do. And anybody who's interested in learning more about the Salmon School or participating or making fish with us, you can go to www.thesalmonschool.com. And we've had notable steelhead anglers that have come in and squeezed fish with us. Jerry French came in. I don't know. I think you're close enough, George. We may be able to get you to come up to the Museum of Glass and make fish with us. John McMillan has been part of it. A list of people. You can see everybody's name on the website. So it's a symbol. So my art in this instance is a symbol for the things that we've been talking about.
Excellent. Well, guys, I've enjoyed speaking with you a lot, and I feel like we could keep going for hours, but I know everyone's got stuff to do. So before I let you go, I got a couple of questions, and I want to make an acknowledgement here. Scott, the MOTIP, okay? The MOTIP is so crucial to our program here on the Lower Skeena. So what we do is we just pretty much fish the Lower Skeena for steelhead. We don't do much on tributaries at all. We're focused on trying to connect with these fish in places that they rest as they're moving through, from Tidewater up almost to Kitwanga, but especially from, the vicinity of the Copper down to Tidewater. And the idea of fishing a short sink tip enables us to fish proximity to structure, to keep the fly within 6 or 8 inches of the bottom and have great control without snagging up. Without the MOTIP, we couldn't do what we do here on the Lower Skeena the way we do it. Whether or not it's the 2.5 sink or the 5 and 5, it's 100% of what we're fishing. So I know you were a big part of that. You're the O and Mo. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
How did you guys come up with that concept?
long story short, it was really Ed Ward who came up with fishing the short tips, not just short tips, right? They had to be fast sinking, right? So really heavy or fast sinking, shorter tips, 4 feet, 5 feet, 6 feet long. And so he was coming up and fishing with me and McCune on the Oregon coast rivers, like the Nehalem and stuff. And so he got us going on that. It was obviously something because of the versatility and presentation that it gave you. You could do more of a grease line sunk fly technique, where it's downstream, a little more downstream presentation, not quite dead drift, but anyway, so you had that, and when it turned on the turn, you didn't have all this fly line lag. You didn't have this big belly, right? It came around much quicker. And so your fly wasn't upstream and you're not rubbing line on fish before the fly gets there. And so we thought that was brilliant. Mike and I started doing it right away. But the first thing you discover was when you put a 5-foot heavy sink tip on the end of your head, it windmills, right? It does a windmill effect as it's going out. You're not going to get a nice turnover cast with it. It just didn't work. And so it was my idea to weld the floating section onto it. And I remember when I told Mike about that, I remember where we were standing, and within seconds, he left and went straight to his house to make those tips. And the next day, he gave me a couple 5 and 5s, and we went out with them, and they were brilliant. And they cast beautifully, and they fished, the same. And so that's basically the story. I'm also the O in Schmucko. and my crew calls me the O in a different word that rhymes with Schmucko.
That's quite the distinction, though, being the O in Schmucko.
I know it, right?
Well, Scott, you guys made me a lot of money because I've, sold the Mo system since it came out for Rio. And, what you guys brought to the table and your initial theories and use that would, literally spawn after that was nothing short of brilliant with you guys. And I actually have a huge write-up that I hand out at Spey events, the brilliance of the Mo system, and talk about you guys as, I refer to you as the 3 Spey-keteers. The 3 of you. And, each one of you always gave a little bit different background or use, care and feeding usage. And each one of them had something really great to take away from each one of you because I've listened to each one of you. I also was in the board meeting at Sage when Mark Bale brought it to the table that this was something we could do. And I'll never forget Simon Gosworth sitting there as a classic, Englishman. He could not see his way around it for love nor money.
Nope.
And, he was absolutely the doubting Thomas in the room. Mark Bale wanted to give it a go. And it was Spey anything in my mind. It was like, bring it. But, eventually Simon got his head around it. But it was pretty amazing to be sitting there at the point of interaction. And, in fact, I got to get in the car here in 9 minutes, Brian, to drive up to the factory to meet 2 new reps that just got hired for Farbank Sage. And so, what a great way to end it.
All right. So I said I had a question. So here it is. And so what we'll do is we'll go around. You guys can each answer my question real quick and let the listeners know how to find you. So I'm going to start with you, Joe, then we'll go to George, then Scott, then Dec. So the question is this, and it's kind of redundant. We talked a lot about this. For anybody listening who wants to learn more, really get into this, give me one book that they should go and find. So Joseph, the book, and then how people can find you, though you did already throw out the Salmon website.
One book for steelhead fly fishing?
Any book that's going to inspire people who, on their fly fishing journey, if you will, or their spey fishing journey. Doesn't have to be steelhead specific.
I'll give you 2 books other than Dec's book. So The Fish and the Fly by John Atherton and 75 Years as a Trout and Salmon Fisherman by Edward Ringwood Hewitt. And those 2 books are available through your favorite antique book dealer. Now, I'd add one more, and that is Flying Salmon by Balfour Kinnear, because that is a spey book, and it actually, Flying Salmon by Balfour Kinnear. Those are the 3 I would pick.
Thank you. And how can people find you and see your work?
Okay, so you can find me at josephrossano.com or thesalmonschool.com.
Awesome. Thank you. George.
Well, I'm going to tell everybody out there to read Dec's book, most certainly, but then go find the Trey Combs' work and read them both, because they'll both tell you lots of great anecdotes and lessons, stories. I think those 2 would be my choice. Where to find me? I'm on Instagram at State of Spey, and then I've got a hunting one separate known as Mule Deer 16, Mule Deer 16. So see you out there.
Thank you. All right, Scott.
So the books, obviously just add to the books these guys are talking about. I mean, Dec's book is, like you said earlier, Brian, is incredibly comprehensive. And then you have to put Trey Combs' Steelhead Fly Fishing and Flies, it's called. And then I'll add, Jock Scott's Grease Line Fishing, which, is brilliant. And then I'm going to add one more that I think is one of the most, I read again recently, one of the most informative fly fishing books. It doesn't have anything to do with rivers or steelhead. It's Randall Kaufman's Lake Fishing with a Fly. That is a truly incredible, informative book. And then getting a hold of me, if you want to fish with me, get a hold of me. I'm exclusive with Flywater Travel. Just find Flywater Travel online, and they do all my calendars and bookings and everything for me. And those guys do a really great job.
Wonderful reason to give Kenny Morris a phone call. One of my favorite people to talk to out there.
There you go.
All right, Dec.
I'm jealous of Scott because he just has to show up.
I love Flywater Travel.
Absolutely. So thanks for the compliments on my book, and I get it. I'm humble about it, but I get it. I remember when it first came out, Scott came up to me, and and it's been 20 years now. I'm a little concerned about what my peers will think and what I might have missed and what they think might, they different. But Scott came up to me and he had this little kind of the mean Scott look face, and he said, "You know what's wrong with your book?" And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "You didn't leave anything for the rest of us to say." And I thought, awesome, what a great compliment. So anyway, I'm going to add to everything, including AHA Wood, including Randall's lake book. Do you remember you and I used to just live in that thing, especially back in the day when we were meeting George and doing all that lake fishing? Pretty cool. So I love, from my influence, and I said this in that book, Haig Brown should be required reading.
Absolutely.
To all those that venture forth to the Steelhead Rivers with rod in hand. And my first book that I read of Haig Brown, and I've since read it multiple times, is A Western Angler. So anything by Haig Brown is pretty good, pretty influential.
Dec, anyone wants to work on their casting with you? How do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I teach, and I'm with Sage and Rio now, like Scott and George. I'm pretty proud about that. It's a big deal, and I don't think there's been any real public announcement of it, but here you go. I'm with Sage, what do you call him, the elite ambassador. So it's pretty fun. And man, I'm plugging, and I'm not just plugging, I'm saying this from my heart. I have not been so excited about a two-handed rod since the R8 came out. I just am goofy over that. And we all cast. We can cast anything. All of us have been at it a long time. We can cast whatever we want, however we want. And I'm excited about that rod. Up to this point, it's been, here's another tool. Here's another tool. I can cast this one all day long. But man, that R8, I'm excited about it. And everyone I put it in their hands is very excited about it as well, including my wife. So I teach these schools all over the place. And if any shop people are listening, you can dial me up. And for any individuals that want private lessons or want to attend those schools, it's just Instagram. It's Dec Hogan, all one word, DECHOGAN. That's how you find me.
Awesome. Anything we missed, guys? Any last comments before I let you go?
Yeah, I should probably say that you can reach me on Instagram at Joseph Rossano, and that I'm an ambassador for Vision Fly Fishing. And so if you have any questions about Vision, give me a shout. And I'd just like to thank everybody for the opportunity to be here with you guys today. It's great.
Me too.
Super fun.
Awesome, guys. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's a real pleasure, and I hope one day we get to all fish together. Wouldn't that be fun up here on the Skeena?
Oh, Brian, who's coming up next year when Eric's there, by the way?
Are you going to come join us?
Hell yeah, didn't we talk about it?
Yeah, okay. I didn't realize it's a lock, so we're good. All right, so we will have Dec Hogan up this spring. This is awesome. I'm stoked. Right on, you guys. Enjoy the rest of your day. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, amigos.
Thanks so much.
Ciao. Thank you.
Well, folks, that was a treat for me to get to chat with this group. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I want to thank Scott, Dec, George, and Joseph for taking the time to share their stories and expertise with us today. Thank you as well to everyone tuning in. We'll be back with another episode for you in the first week of August. In the meantime, please feel free to send in show comments and questions by email to info@skeenaspey.com. You can find In the Bucket Podcast online at www.inthebucketpodcast.com. If you're on Instagram, you can follow us at In the Bucket Podcast. Thanks again. I'm Brian Niska, and you've been listening to In the Bucket Podcast, brought to you by the Wet Fly Swing.